All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, March 7th of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. We've got a handful of questions in our queue for today's stream already. It looks like, I would say, a general trend or a general, I guess a trend is a good way to say it, of a lot of questions about the difference between making adjustments in step 1 versus step 3, what's preferred, is there a better way to do it for certain goals, for certain processes? So we'll definitely talk a little bit about that. I see a handful of different questions related to that. Had a question about some single entry strategy overall, some broader single entry strategies. So we'll go ahead. We'll get into this here. As always, we'll get the app pulled up here. If you have questions for me, go ahead and pop them into the YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we'll handle questions in about the order that they come in. I wanted to hop over here and maybe play around with the FanDuel side of things today. I know I almost always happen to just use DraftKings as kind of like my default home site when we're messing around building lineups, but maybe we'll go ahead. We'll mess around with FanDuel a little bit today here to switch things up. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm gonna start here. I kind of wanted to start with this first question that came in yesterday. This is from Tone 930. This is a bit of a follow up here. So this is a follow-up from a previous conversation. So I'm going to, rather than reading this whole thing out, there's a pretty long post and a 15 comment chain here in the replies. But basically, it sounds like what Tone is doing here is calculating for a percent chance of hitting a certain target score by using the percentiles here. And then Tone, it sounds like what you're doing to me is a linear regression between these percentiles based on the equation that you've provided here. Ultimately, again, I think there's kind of a lot of back and forth here, and it sounds like there's some like using this to ultimately help support a research build. I don't have any problem with this. I think that's all. I think it can all be a valuable way to add some value to your process. Another way, basically, to quantify if a player is optimally owned or not. I will basically only say this. The only thing that popped into my mind as I was reading through this is to be cautious with doing this anything else really besides NBA. Mostly because that regression that you're doing is really only going to work. It's really only going to work well in NBA. Doing a linear regression between two different percentiles in any other sport, I think there's issues with doing it in NBA, but it's at least going to be closest on the NBA side of things. Other sports where players are a little less normally distributed, I think you're going to start running into issues, assuming that basically that the distance or the difference between a certain percentile, 2 percentile scores is linear, and that you can basically say that, for example, the 80th percentile is exactly in between these two values. That assumption works okay for NBA, won't work well for other sports as much. So, but otherwise, I think basically strategically what you're trying to do here, I'm on board with it. So wanted to start there. I know for those of you watching without the context here, that might not be as helpful. If you are interested in reading a little bit more about this, there is a thread in Slack going back yesterday from Tone 930 that talks a little bit more about this. Wanted to talk about that a little bit on stream. I guess that's a good opportunity to say, if you're not in Slack, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're not already in Slack, there's a link to join our Slack community in the description of every past Office Hours video. Great conversation going on there every day. You can get a little bit more context for some of these conversations that are coming out of Slack, and also get the opportunity to get your questions answered first on stream, because I always start here with the questions that are in Slack. So with that said, let's keep it going here. And we'll go ahead and we'll, I guess, kind of copy paste our first question of the day that really can be demoed here. And this is from Carl. And Carl asks, can you please do a quick refresher on how to make a negative correlation group rule? How many are allowed per build? Thanks. Yeah. So the new groups live under the rules tab here in step 2. So click build lineups and then rules. And then we'll go over to groups here. and then click add a group rule. And you can add however many players you want in here. So let's see if there's one that maybe, let's look at, see if there's one that we could find that actually has like a practical reason. Okay, so a ton of Portland value tonight. Watford and Eubanks both showing up as value. Are they negatively correlated? They are. So obviously, I guess a good thing to note here is that correlation is automatically going to be taken into account when we build your lineups without having to set a single rule. If you get Watford and Eubanks in the same lineup with default settings, for example, here, what that is saying, the builder is saying, is that we understand these two players are negatively correlated, right? We are tracking correlation. Correlation is at moderate. With that said, in this particular set of sims that is building that lineup, they are valuable enough, they have enough upside that they can, despite their average negative correlation, they can be optimal together. However, you are definitely entitled and maybe even strategically optimal to group these two players out. And if you wanted to do so, we could say Watford and Eubanks. So first thing we're doing is we're adding these two players to a single group. We'll click save. And then we need to set the logic. So in this case, we want less than or equal to 1. So that's how you would do it. And then each of our builds for this particular set will never include these two players together. So typically the actual way I recommend doing this in practice is start with a test build and see what kind of combinations of players that you are getting without any groups, and see what kind of team stacks in particular you are getting. This is specifically for NBA. See what kind of team stacks you're getting. See who is in those stacks. Look and see what the correlations of these players actually are to one another, and then decide who you want to group out, right? I think this is a decent group to make if you wanted to. I think you'll probably get a lot of these two players together in lineups without them. And I think that there's a decent enough negative correlation that I wouldn't talk you out of creating a group there. Probably maybe some Golden State groups that might make sense tonight as well. But that's how you do it. Okay, and then interesting question here from Stanley. And this is about the step 1 versus step 3 kind of stuff we were talking about here. He said, I may be approaching this incorrectly, but I find that it's more beneficial to make most of your changes in step 1 rather than step 3 for a couple reasons. 1, isn't your pool of 1500 static after the build, meaning that the pool doesn't get updated when the projections change. And 2, if you've been making a lot of changes to exposures and projections in step 3 and you have to rebuild after news or updates, you need to be super quick and make all the changes you made. Good points here. So first one, let's talk about number 1 first. Isn't your pool of 1500 static after the build, meaning that the pool doesn't get updated when projections change? That is true. I guess these two things kind of come together. They kind of combine together a little bit. But on the first point here, the main reason that the fact that your 1500 lineups don't change when news breaks, to me, is a better reason, is a better reason to rebuild lineups when news breaks rather than refreshing an existing build, right? So yes, this is true. Your pool of 1500 lineups, if you build them, will update throughout the day as news breaks, but only in the form of resorting your lineups rather than actually rebuilding them, right? So let's build some lineups here and at least have this as an example. So in this particular build, it is 12:10 my time here. We are building 500 lineups with the theoretical purpose here of playing 20 of them, right? As throughout the day, as the projections update and new sims run and things like that, right, we will resort these lineups based on what the new best 20 you can play are, but we will never rebuild. This 500 is indeed static, so you can't get any more. So to me, that is a better reason why at lock, it makes sense to start with a new build rather than coming in here and refreshing, right? In general, best practice is when news breaks to start with a fresh build rather than refreshing an existing build. So I guess that kind of does then get us to the point here of number 2, which is saying if you've made a lot of changes to exposures and projections in step 3 and you need to rebuild, then you need to be really quick and remember all the changes you made. Yeah, I think if you are going to have a process where you are making a lot of adjustments, there is a strong reason for this reason exactly to do some more of that in step one, because it's a little bit more flexible. It's also more flexible for late swap, right? We do our best we can to track your desired exposures in the entry editor as you are late swapping, but they can be a little flaky. They can be a little bit hard to maintain your exact exposures. They also are not flexible to updated news. So, for example, if you've made a lot of updates and bumped a lot of players' projections up, and news breaks later that makes other players also have a more competitive projection, when you late swap, we'll deal with those two things well, right? We'll be able to decide, is it still worth playing the players that you've bumped projections up on now that them exposures instead in the entry editor? That's not as flexible to new news. If you say, I want 40% of this player no matter what, even if news breaks, new sims run, new value is opened up, you're still going to get forced 40%. So if you have an approach that is, if you are making a lot of adjustments in general and want to retain those adjustments through locks and through news breaking and through entry editors and things like that, or through late swap, I think there's a pretty compelling reason to make some more of those adjustments in step one, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, abandon step three completely, right? I don't think this has to be so much one or the other, but I think you can kind of get an idea, run what is basically a test build, get an idea on the players that you want to adjust up or down one direction or the other, and jump back to step one and make some adjustments there. So it's a little bit more flexible. You can almost kind of prime it, right? Like when you're sitting 10 minutes before lock, waiting for that final starting lineup to come out, like it pretty much seems to do every single night, you can, I would say you can have your step one primed with some of the other stands or adjustments you want to take on the slate, right? So maybe you've done your test builds and your research builds a half hour before, and you know that there are certain players that you're targeting to be under on or over on, or you have some certain strategic angles that you're playing. Those adjustments can already kind of be preloaded in here. And then when finally that Pistons lineup that you've been waiting on comes out, you let the sims run and then you do your final build. I think that's a great approach. I think that's fine. I don't do that as much because I'm not super concerned with making a ton of adjustments going into lock. I've mentioned that before, right? I think the one caveat here is this is assuming that you want to make a lot of adjustments throughout the slate or even heading into the slate. I find that there's a bigger edge in my process of just basically waiting for that right late swap opportunity to come up, that I'm not super concerned with making a ton of adjustments to exposures and things like that pre-lock. But yeah, I think there's overall a pretty compelling case that if you want to make a lot of adjustments on the NBA side of things because of the way the sport plays and because of some of the ways that the app is set up, you're justified in doing a little bit more of that in step one. But good question. So, Mark had asked a quick question here about tiers. We don't have tier support yet. He asked if there's recommended slider settings or techniques you can use for the tiers. The tiers shouldn't even be loaded into the app. So there are tiers. We don't have tier support yet. You won't be able to use the app really in any way to actually build real tiers lineups. You certainly could use our projections and go and search and see what are the highest projected players or how do the projections of different players in different tiers compare to one another. But we don't have formal tiers support yet. It is on our list to implement. So, and then Epic Problem asked, is there a League of Legends stream coming soon? Yes. In a general sense, yes. We do want to do a new updated esports stream now that we have, well, I don't even want to say esports necessarily, specifically a League of Legends stream now that we have new sims, we have detailed stat projections, we have distributions and correlations available on the League of Legends side. The League of Legends model has been the recipient of quite a bit of work since the last time we did a stream. There are a couple other content changes or content plans that we want to do first. So I don't have a date for when we expect to do this, But we do want to do a league stream in the near future. So, okay, cool. So another question here from Dallas. And this question says, okay, we talked last week about building 150 and doing rank for the single entry, 3 max, 20 max. And I do think I like this better. I did some lineup study and see Shady Advice uses rank as well from what I can tell. I feel like the top 20 lineups become very fragile when editing in step 3 for the 150. Say you set 10% min exposure on a player you are getting none of and 60% on someone who is in every lineup. The 10% guy will not appear in any top 20, and the 60% will appear in 20 out of 20. Same will happen if you edit or boost projections in step 3. Would be the ideal way to do this to just set lineups to 20 and adjust projections so they meet what you want, and then bump it back to the 150 lineups and save. I know the ideal would be to have separate builds, but that is tough in NBA. I feel like late swap will end up taking out players you worked hard to get into the top 20 if you have limited exposure to early games. Thank you. Yeah, so this is tricky. In some ways, this is in some ways this is intended functionality, right? And let me explain what I mean. So let me get an entries file in here. I should have, yeah. Okay. And let's build. So I've got kind of a spread of different contests here tonight, right? I've got the 150, 25 max, 20 max, 3 max, and 2 single entries, right? So let's say, for example, that we built lineups for this slate. And let's build 1,500 so we have a big pool. And I'll show you what I kind of mean. Like, what you are describing here, I don't think is objectively a problem unless you specifically want to avoid this, right? But let's let the build finish first, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail. So, and we'll talk about ways you can avoid this too, or at least maybe do some experiments here, because I think this is an interesting question. So, it'll give me a moment to catch my breath, get caught up here. All right. Okay. So we have 150, right? So the idea is that we're going to rank fill this into our build. So there's some level of concern about who's in our top 20, who's in our top 1, our top 3, our top 25, right? So what this build is basically saying is that these are the best 150 we can play of our 1,500 here. As we adjust exposures, right, if we want to limit risk, for example, right, there is nowhere the new lineups can come from than the bottom of than the lower Saber score lineups, right? If we are managing our risk and capping exposures to some of these guys, these new lineups are naturally coming in from the bottom. So as we adjust and get to these exposures, oh, that should have been 50, right? That's where that's going to go. What happened there? And same thing if we do it the other way, right? Like, let's say we want to, let's look at our negative leverage. Let's say we want a little bit of hardened exposure, right? Well, where can 15% hardened lineups even come from? They have to come from the bottom. They have to come from lower Saber score lineups. So what that means then is if we look at like our top 20 here, right? We are, oh, okay. Actually, we can't do it like that because the max exposure is honored throughout. If we were to look for harden, right? We set a minimum exposure. We are going to see that we don't have a single harden lineup until lineup 119, right? So there would be no harden in our top 20. And in some ways, this is kind of what I mean if this is intended functionality. In some ways, because this lineup is worse according to Saber score, it makes sense that maybe it isn't one of the lineups that we want to double down on in the top 1, top 3, top 20, top 25 lineups, right? This is a lineup that, by the definition of Saber score, is a less profitable lineup, right? In some ways, it's a hedge against the lineups that we are doubling down on at the top of our list. If you wanted, though, overall, a more flat exposure, right? So you want your essentially you want your exposure to be somewhat even throughout all of your lineups. I think there's a couple options. I think the first is to set all of your exposures here to kind of what you want. It's basically what I just did before, but instead of using the ranked fill, to actually create individual different lineup sets, which will have a similar effect. It just won't be a complete rank fill. So what I mean by that is basically create a lineup set for, I would say, probably your top 25. And what this is going to do is it's going to make, for my contest, for example, it's going to make sure that we have some Harden here. And then what you can do is save this and name this and say that this is my top 25, right? And then you have your 150. Right. So we already have the 150. Let's save this though as well. And this is my top 150. And then to fill these a little bit differently. So then if we went back to the entries thing, there's a handful of different ways to do this. I think some combination of the different fill methods is probably the way to go. So your top 150, you can just exact match to fill your 150 max, right? And then probably uncheck this. And I would say, something like this would probably work to get this done. And that's going to mean that, you have a flatter exposure throughout all of your lineups, right? There are other ways to handle this. I know you had mentioned, Dallas, that updating your projections in step 3 doesn't have the intended effect. I think it should. So let's say, for example, instead of doing what we just did, let's go back to Harden. And instead of setting a minimum exposure, let's bump his projection until we get 15%. It's probably going to take a little bit more. 54. That's fine. Okay, so we have 20% Harden. Oops. So I do think bumping your projections until you get the exposure you want is an alternative here. Like if we bump, instead of setting Harden's minimum exposure to 15%, if we just bump his projection up until we have 20%-ish, especially if you're not super concerned with the exact number there, you can see in this case, now we have lineups in the top 20 that have Harden in it. So I do think that's an alternative. I think there's kind of two ways to do it. And it kind of depends on really how specific and precise you want your exposures to be. But I think one way is to set all of your max exposures and then save the individual lineup sets as you go along to be used to fill in by changing this number of lineups, basically. I think the alternative is to make adjustments to the player's projection in step 3 until you have the right exposure rather than the exposure. So let me know if that helps. A couple different ways to do it. Let me make sure I answered all the questions here. The last note is on late swap. And as long as you are, I think late swap should still be, should still work with this, right? So when you fill in builds, we will pull in your minimum and maximum projections here, or minimum and maximum exposures. So that should still be pretty flexible here. If you have edited things with the projections instead, I actually think you could run into some issues there. No, actually, it looks like we copied that over as well. So yeah, it should work either way. We pull in the projections and ownership and minimum and maximum exposures, it looks like, from the build that was used most recently to fill. So in this case, that should work. So, but I do think there is still a question overall. I guess something that you should be conscious of when you're thinking about this is that there's in some ways you are contradicting kind of SaberScore. That SaberScore is saying, okay, if you want if you want to take this approach and force exposure to a player into your lineups, it makes sense to use the lineups that are at the end of your pool to do this, essentially. These are lineups that are theoretically less profitable, so you should be less invested into them. Going about it this way is kind of a direct contradiction to that, which again is totally fine, but it should be something that's a conscious decision that you're saying, no, I believe that 15% James Harden is not something that is optimal only for the tail end of lineups that are only getting entered into the piggy bank shot. I believe that 15% James Harden is optimal evenly throughout every contest I'm playing. So, but good, really good question there. Good thing to talk about here. So, I see some questions picking up in YouTube chat, so we'll get to those shortly, but we're going to start here, or we're going to finish up the questions that are in Slack first. And this is from Brad. And it says, just a general question, what do you/most people find yourself adjusting the most? I know it's difficult for everyone, but what do you find the most effective? I usually don't mess with stats or projections. I lean on leverage, whether good or bad, and figured most do the same. I don't think it's necessarily true that like one is better than the other here. I do think if you are unsure of what to do or how best to add value to the process, you are going to find that your time is probably better spent more in step 3 than step 1. And I know that maybe in some ways kind of contradicts what I was talking about here at the start of the stream. I think there are sports-specific nuances with the way NBA plays out and how late news breaks and how quickly you need to be able to rebuild for NBA to be successful. But I would say in general, right, this is a generally phrased question. If you are unsure of how to add value or what to do, I would make more adjustments in step 3 than step 1. The reason why is because step 3 is very safe, right? We are building you a big pool of lineups, 500, 1,500, however many you build, that are already viable for the contest. And what you are doing in step 3 is you are selecting for some or others based on your risk tolerance or your strategy or whatever you want to do. But it's very hard to make a mistake in step 3. It's very hard to end up with a set of lineups that are just bad because the lineups themselves have already been built for your particular contest. In step 1 and step 2, really, in step 1, you're changing the inputs to the system, right? There are absolutely ways you can make mistakes in step 1. There are ways to prevent yourself from making significant mistakes. One of the best ways I think that you can make adjustments in step 1 without making significant mistakes is to limit yourself to 10% adjustments on players before making bigger adjustments from there, right? I think my dog just like howled. I don't know if anybody heard that on the mic. But for example, if you want to be lower on Jokic, right? Don't know why anybody would want to do that. But let's say you want it to be lower on Jokic. Adjusting him by just 10% down is going to be a little bit of a safer adjustment than just trying to than doing even this, right? Because you're adjusting the inputs to the system here. Same thing on step 2, right? Going in and setting a rule to prevent 2 players from showing up in the same lineup together or to force certain stack constructions. There are situations where that can be a good move strategically, but you are changing the fundamental rules of the way lineups can be built, and you can make mistakes there, right? Step 3, it is very, very hard to make a big mistake, I would say. So if you are unsure of what to do, I would start there. And when you are playing more new sports, for example, if you've just started playing a new sport or something like that, I think making more adjustments in step 3 and then working your way towards adjustments in step 1 is a good way to do that. So, but with that said, and I'll kind of just give like a general caveat to all of that. Your pool of in step 3 is what it is after you've built it. You can sort through and get your 20 or 150 or whatever you want, but you can't change that pool of 1,500 for a given build. That was built from a certain set of inputs and rules in step 2. The more information that you tell us in steps 1 and step 2, the better your pool in step 3 is ultimately going to be. So there is kind of a general caveat. There is a reason things are editable in step 1 and step 2. There is a reason to make changes there. Especially as you get more comfortable or as you feel very confident about the way you want to tackle a slate, right? that is the strongest reason to make adjustments in step 1 and step 2, is because it will give you a stronger pool in step 3 from which to work with. But overall, I would say that those are safer adjustments in step 3. And like coming back to the specific language of the question, more of my adjustments in general are going to come on step 3 than step 1. Even in the sports where I do the most stuff, so to speak, right? I've talked a little bit about my, there are videos up on our YouTube channel about my baseball process, my football process, sports where I do a little bit more adjusting than I do in NBA. A lot of that stuff does come on step 3. So, and even on the sports and slates where I've spent the most time actually specifically researching and planning for that particular slate, ultimately, a lot of what I do generally assumes that the projections are great. It assumes that the build rules and setting sliders are optimized based on the defaults that I put in there. And then I will spend most of my time selecting for my lineups that I want to use out of my 1500 in step 3, rather than spending a ton of time trying to change the inputs and the build rules in step 2. But that's just my process. So cool. Okay. Jack asks a really interesting question. This is the last one that's in Slack at the moment, and then we'll bump over to YouTube chat, which I see is popping today. So welcome, everybody. Jack says, hi, Jordan. How does a person know when they have a solid/good process for winning lineups? It's tough. It's a tough question. Mostly because ROI and purely looking at profit are pretty fickle numbers and require a really long sample size. I mean, you need a long sample size to determine if you have a winning process no matter what. But especially trying to take a profit-driven approach, you need an extremely long sample size. I do think one tool that I would highly recommend is RotoTracker. What RotoTracker will do is it will take your historical CSVs from different sites, process all of the past slates you've played, and it'll show you both in terms of profit. It'll show you in terms of profit and loss, where you stand. But it'll also show you what's called finishing position as a way of looking at your overall lineups. And that will give you a tool of basically seeing how often are you placing your lineups into the top 1% of a contest. That's something I talk about a lot. While there's a lot of variance in even first and second place in a contest, that would shift your ROI or profitability pretty significantly. When you look at top 1% equity, it can be a really good way of determining if you are profitable theoretically long-term in a sport, despite what your individual variance of wins or losses has been recently. I think that's one of the best overall tools to determining if your process is working. Now, that's still going to need a decent runway of sample size to populate, right? To figure out, you won't be able to tell just even after a week necessarily if you're successful at a particular sport. I think that's kind of like a 2 week to a month to a season kind of endeavor regardless. But I think that's a good place to start. I think that's a very quantitative approach to knowing if your process is working. I think there's qualitative approaches to knowing if your process is working as well. Those are a little trickier, but I think that came out of my mouth, and I don't even know what I would really say is a qualitative, shorter term approach to knowing if your process is working. At least not in a way that's compelling. So I think that's probably your best way to go about doing it. I guess one thing that is somewhat qualitative is if your process is changing dramatically from slate to slate, right? Really no amount of review is really going to help you determine if you have a good process or not. You have to give yourself a little bit of time for something to kind of settle in and give yourself an opportunity to review it one way or the other. I guess that would be one way. It's kind of outside the bounds of the question entirely. But if your process changes every single night, if you can't even say that there are certain steps that you do repeatedly every single night, you're going to have a very hard time judging yourself at all. Because where do you start? How do you determine what's working, what isn't? I also think, this is less on the side of just like winning or not, but there is an efficiency component to DFS that especially during NBA season, I don't think always gets talked about often enough. But you need to be able to do what you need to get done in NBA in about 10 or 15 minutes at max, right? I think if you have a process in NBA, and this kind of relates to some of the questions that we were talking about earlier, where, how do you repeat your steps when in a brand new build to account for the latest sims? I think there's a compelling argument that if you can't do what you need to do in NBA in about 10 minutes or less, your process probably isn't effective. Because the most important thing at the end of the day, when you're building your NBA lineups, is to get the most up-to-date news. And if you are sacrificing updated information to do a longer-winded process that rests on old information, you're probably losing more than you're gaining. So I think there's an interesting argument there as well of like looking at how long your process takes, and for the particular sport, how much time, how long your process can afford to be. In golf, if you told me you had a 6-hour golf process that took 6 hours to do from beginning to end, I would probably say, I mean, if it is worth 6 hours of your time, great, but you're not going to lose any edge there. If you told me you had a 30-minute long NBA process, I would probably be legitimately concerned about your ability to get that done with information that you need to be successful. So I think there's an argument there of like looking at how long does your process take? How efficient can you be for that particular sport? But yeah, it's a good question. It's a simple question, right? How do I know if I'm playing well? And it's somewhat of a challenging question to answer. So I do think, again, I think the most quantitative way of checking your results would be to use a tracker like RotoTracker and see your top 1% equity over a longer sample size. But qualitatively, another one that comes to mind, and maybe then we'll move on to some of these other questions that is coming in. I also think flexibility is kind of a qualitative thing that you should ask yourself about your process. How much room do you give yourself to account for the situation where you're potentially wrong, especially in lineup construction, right? I often push back. There was one last week on Friday when I see processes that are very rigid in terms of available lineup constructions. I think those sometimes can help more than they hurt, right? Saying that you only accept a certain position in your utility spot. For a sport like NFL, for example, instead of saying a quarterback plus 1 to 3 pass catchers, saying something like a quarterback plus 2 wide receivers, right? That's an inflexible way of writing a rule. Overly grouping out your lineups is another good example. We talked about groups here at the start. I think selectively using some groups to account for, or to additionally account for correlation in NBA can be a good approach. But if you had 25 different groups in here to account for every single negatively correlated player that showed up together in a test build or something like that, you may be creating an inflexible set of lineup rules that isn't very receptive to different unique lineup constructions, for example. I think those are two really good things to ask yourself about your process that are more on the qualitative side. Is how flexible do I allow my lineups to be? More flexibility, I would argue, is better. And how efficient and how quickly can I get my process done for the particular sport in question? But good stuff. Okay. I'm going to hop over to YouTube chat, get the questions that have come in through the start of the stream here today. T said, what are the slider settings for an NBA research build? Is it 0-0-10 or is it different for NBA? It's still the same in theory, right? The research build that we typically talk about, right? What this build does for every sport, it is not different on a sport to sport basis. What this does for every single sport is it will take a single game simulation and build the optimal lineup for that single game, or in this case, it'll take a single game simulation of every game on the slate, right? Essentially a slate simulation, and give you the optimal lineup for that sim. And then it'll move on to the next lineup. And it'll do that 1,500 times. And you essentially, at the end of that, will have a 1,500 slate simulation sample size of data to work with. And you can use that to study exposures. How often are players showing up in the optimal lineups? You can compare that against projected ownership and look for leverage opportunities. It is theoretically always the same, right? What you choose to do with that information and how valuable that information is kind of what changes sport to sport. So part of the reason I don't actually like doing this in NBA too much, there's a couple different reasons. I think one of the main ones, one of the primary ones, is that this information is a picture of how the slate looks like when you build this research build. And in NBA, since there's news breaking throughout the slate, there are late swap opportunities. This is only going to be so valuable. I find that, especially on a early March 8-game NBA slate, the odds that we get slate breaking news at some point during the slate are pretty high. Slate breaking news breaks your research just as well. So how valuable this is kind of depends on how much news breaks after lock. But, one example that pops right here, pretty high up here, is that Jimmy Butler appears to be 16.7% more highly owned than he shows up in the optimal lineup, at least at the moment where the projections are right now. Another limitation here of a research build is, for NBA in particular, is that one of the fundamental assumptions with a research build, I've mentioned this on streams a lot before here, but one of the fundamental assumptions here when you build 0-0-10 is that the percent chance that a player has to show up in the optimal lineup for a single slate simulation is roughly equivalent to the percent chance that the player has to show up in the winning lineup in your contest. For NBA, that assumption is not as strong. And you can actually just see that. You can tell roughly how strong of an assumption that is by looking at how high the sim variance slider is by default. And in this case for NBA, a lower variance sport where we can rely on average projections a little bit more and be successful, not so much, but a little bit more, that assumption, you can see it's not as strong of an assumption. So there are some challenges there with an NBA. I always want to talk about this. I get a lot of questions about research builds for NBA, totally understandable, especially with how often we talk about them on stream here. But I always want to be totally transparent when these come up and just basically say that I don't use these for those two reasons. I don't use them because late swap throws it all out of the window when news breaks, and two, because I have concerns about the strength of that assumption. There was actually a comment in Slack. Who said this? Where did I find this? It was Barron as a reply to Tone. And he just said, for example, if a player is showing up in the optimal 50% of the time, but is minus 24 leverage off of a projected. So like, let's use the Jimmy Butler example, right? Showing up 28.7% of the time, optimal or owned 54.4% of the time. As a way to kind of counteract that bad assumption on the NBA side, I do think one way to handle this is, instead of like fully fading players that show up as a very high negative leverage score here, to maybe go half the field on these guys, for example, right? Because you don't necessarily need the perfect optimal to win the slate. So that's one particular answer to that. But anyway, good question. The question originally was, what are the correct sliders? And I went into kind of a longer question about research builds in general. But anyway, let's keep it going. Okay. Eric said, hey man, I usually don't play on the weekend. I've got the FanDuel live final this weekend. Projections are updated throughout the weekend, I would assume. Yeah, we do all the weekend slates. One of the things that is nice here about our tools is that they are more or less essentially automated. So the sim robot never sleeps. We will have our NBA projections and sims and updating for late news and things like that throughout the weekend for the live finals, just as we normally do. Good luck. Congratulations on the ticket as well. Those are a lot of fun. CMC Man said, playing multiple max entry games and trying to do step in step one is not easy. Yeah, I think, again, it kind of depends a little bit on what your individual process looks like. Like the counterpoint to this is that if you put all of your adjustments in step one, it's very easy to just rattle off your builds. Boom, 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 pretty quickly. Like if you're saying, I'm gonna leave my adjustments for step one, I'm gonna adjust projections, I'm gonna set min and max exposures, I'm gonna do that stuff there. It theoretically makes it kind of easy to just knock your builds off, assuming you're not going to make any other changes in the build page. So it kind of depends on what your strategy looks like. But Eric said, quick question. How often do you late swap throughout the night? Do you late swap every time projections are updated? Thanks. Yeah, generally. What I will almost always do is I will go to Basketball Monster and I'll check this player news tab, and I will look to see if there's news here. If there's something, if there's a line item listed here, typically to me that's a good reason to swap. So sometimes it's a player getting ruled out, right? In that case, you don't even really need to check. Like if it's, let's say you're going through the slate and 15 minutes before the Jazz tip off, Gobert gets ruled out, like you obviously need to swap for that situation, right? That is a clear situation you need to be swapping for. But let's say, that we are going into the same lock period and San Antonio has a lot of doubtful players tonight, right? Let's say we get a weird San Antonio lineup. We get a different San Antonio lineup than expected. That will typically still show up as a line item on the Basketball Monster alerts. And it'll say like somebody's starting. To me, that's another good indication to swap. So I guess the reason why those starting lineup changes can be a little bit harder to know if you should swap or if something even happened is because like if a player gets ruled out, there's a lot of fanfare about it, right? The underdog tweet comes out. It's typically, people are probably talking about it in Slack. It's pretty obvious that a player got ruled out. Starting lineups are a little bit harder. Underdog will tweet the starting lineups, but unless you've been following the news very closely all day, you don't necessarily know if it's different than what was expected. It's hard to go back and see what was the previously expected lineup if the sim is already run. So I like to use this as a way to kind of see if news has broken and you need to update. If you are unsure if you should update, I know there was a lot of discussion about this in Slack over the weekend as well. If you are unsure if you should late swap or if you should adjust, just do it. You are always better off late swapping than not. The discussions that have been in Slack over the weekend where people will compare a lineup before it late swapped and after it late swapped, and the earlier lineup scored better on that particular slate. So like that is not a good argument to not late swap. It's really not. That is a single slate sample size. There's a range of outcomes of any individual lineup. And looking at one way the slate played out, the way that it happened to play out, and saying that one lineup is better than another is not a good argument for why or why not you should be late swapping, right? You are often going to, assuming that there is news, late swap into lineups that have a higher expected value. And worst case, if there is no news and you late swap anyway, all you're going to do is late swap into a lineup that probably has equivalent expected value. You're going to make a neutral swap. So it doesn't really matter. That's the worst case that's going to happen if you swap when there was nothing that changed, right? Just let me put it this way. In the same way that at the end of the night, when you look at a contest and look at first, second, third, fourth, fifth, in the same way that those lineups are not ordered in expected value, it is in the same way that is true, that swapping to a lineup that scored less in actual points that night does not mean that was a worse lineup, right? The highest scoring lineups at the end of the night are not the highest expected value lineups. So a lineup that scores less than the previous version of what that lineup was is not a lower expected value lineup. So anyway, the kind of to wrap this one up, I like to use this Basketball Monster news dashboard to see when news breaks, when it makes sense to swap. But if you are unsure, you should just do it. So, Brad had mentioned with the question I asked in Slack, I see how this actually leads to help with what I was kind of thinking on and getting a guy you want more in your top lines, changing projections instead of leverage. Yeah, if you make an adjustment to your exposures in your pool of, whatever it is, 100 lineups, and you want to see a guy in roughly evenly dispersed throughout that, right? If your expectation is that, I guess let me put it this way. So we have 30% Karl Anthony Towns. If your expectation would be that you could reach into your pool of 100 and pull out any random number of lineups, and Towns would be approximately close to 30%, then you should probably make adjustments. Or actually, I guess it's not a good example because that is the exposure we got to him by default. But here, let's pick a better example. I'm going to confuse somebody here. Okay. So you want some Rudy Gobert. You want 20% Rudy Gobert, hypothetically. Okay. If your expectation would be that you have 20% of Rudy Gobert evenly dispersed throughout all of your lineups, you would be better off doing this by adjusting his projection than doing it this way. Because what this is just going to do, probably almost all of your last, actually virtually 100% of your last 20 are all going to have Rudy Gobert in it. So another option here too is to unique fill, is to fill these uniquely into your lineups, because then unique random, sorry, because then your 20 Rudy Gobert lineups are going to randomly fill into 20 contests. So cool. Okay. John says, if we want to hand build our lineups after doing a test build, how many players should we hand select before we let SaberSim come in and clean up? Smash that like button. All right. Here's what I would do. I would kind of let the builder answer this question for you. So like, here's what I mean. So you've done a test build, you've done some research, and you want to hand build a lineup with SaberSim. Here's what I would do. I would go in. So I'm assuming we're using a single entry contest, for example, right? We're probably playing a single entry, but set the sliders to what makes sense for the contest you are playing, right? So maybe in this case, I think that's about reasonable, right? FanDuel, 1,000 to 10,000 single entry. Build yourself a nice big pool of lineups, right? Doesn't have to necessarily be 1,500. Could be 1,000. Could just be the 500. Whatever. Give yourself a nice pool, right? And why is this? Let's do this. Okay. And then build the lineup, right? Build this pool. We'll give this a second to build here. And I guess what you can do is that we know that we have 1,500 lineups in this pool. So if we make so many adjustments, or if we lock so many players in, that we ultimately get to the point where we don't have a lineup that fits this, what SaberSim is telling us is that there is not a lineup in the first 1,500 best lineups you could play for this contest that works. So let's go ahead and start messing with this and say, Harden's been our example all day. So let's stay with Harden. Let's say we've decided that we are lock button Harden, right? So our lineup is 100% going to have Harden in it. Great. So we did that. And now let's say hypothetically we don't want to play Jimmy Butler, right? Because he came up as a negative leverage in our research build. So maybe we remove Butler, right? And maybe we decided that we want to play DeJounte Murray, right? We want to lock DeJounte Murray in, right? So we're continuing to go through here, and let's keep going here and say, what's something else? I don't even know. Let's exclude Sabonis, right? The Knicks, I'm just trying to come up with reasons to do things, right? We're excluding Sabonis. The Knicks play slow, right? This is still pretty flexible. The builder's still working for us here, right? Let's say we want to, I don't know. Let's say we want to cross off Luka. Too expensive, right? We're continuing to go in. I guess I don't need to take this all the way to the conclusion, but at some point, right? Let's keep locking players in. So let's say we also want to lock in LeBron, because we want to, okay. So at some point here, let me show you this, right? So now this message pops up at the bottom. This is saying we need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures, continue building. We could click yes here, but I think what a better thing to do is at this point is to say, I've gone too far, right? I'm building a single lineup for a single entry contest between, say maybe 5,000 total lineups in it. And in this case, I have so many adjustments here. I have so many players that are locked or removed from the pool that there isn't a single lineup in the best 1,500 I can play. So let's undo this. I would say at this point, let's reset. You could reset all exposures and start over, or you could just undo the last thing you did, which in this case was LeBron. So maybe we unlock LeBron and we go back and we play this lineup, which has like a couple different Lakers in it, has a different version of that same kind of overall feel. Or we could start over, reset all of our exposures, start from the beginning and kind of go back in here. So, again, looking at this question, how many players should we hand select before we let SaberSim come in and clean up? I wouldn't think about it as a number of players. I would basically build yourself with default sliders, a big pool of lineups, and make adjustments until either you are happy or until SaberSim tells you to back off. If SaberSim tells you to back off, pull some of that out, right? You don't need to make all those adjustments. You are probably playing a lineup that isn't very good, frankly, if you've gone that far. So that's what I would do. I think that's a really good approach overall to like hand building. I always say hand picking instead of hand building, right? Like in this particular example, let's put some of this stuff back in. So we had Harden, we liked Murray, we had removed Jimmy Butler, right? I actually think like maybe this was actually a pretty decent lineup, right? This also had LeBron, which we had kind of wanted. So in this case, we're playing lineup 232. Surely lineup 232 is a decent lineup for this contest, and we got to leave a little bit of value on it, right? So, and you can actually use this rank to kind of see how far down the pool you're progressing, right? If we do the same thing we did before and X out Sabonis, we make a jump to 251. I think the next thing we did there was X out Luka, and we jumped to 294, right? So as you do things, yeah, so that's kind of where the LeBron thing failed. But anyway, as you do things, you'll kind of move through your pool and can kind of let that come to you. So JWH says, I think we've previously talked about editing ownership projections as a potential value add. Do you think OLS regression would be differentiable from your projections that it'd be worth the effort? Oh gosh. Let's see. If we manually adjust the SaberSim, okay, these are two different questions. JWH, unfortunately, I don't know what an OLS regression is. So I am not sure. If you can kind of describe to me what that does, even mathematically, I think I'll be able to get a little bit closer. But I don't know what that is. I am not a programmer, so I don't have that computer science or deeper math background. So I will need a little bit more context there. And then, okay, so let's answer this. So if we manually adjust the SaberSim, I will say, first of all, that what you are adjusting when you adjust projections is the mean, not the median. It is the mean. What happens to the player's range of outcomes? Does it readjust the range to a new range with the median we put by shifting the distribution? Yes, that is exactly what happens. So if you make the adjustment to Jokic, for example, that we were talking about before, so if you adjust this, for example, to 52.04, subtracting 5 points from Jokic's mean projection, what we do is we take every single individual game sim and lower his output in that sim by 5 points, which basically has the exact outcome of taking this exact range of outcomes, like his exact, and shifting it over to the left by 5 fantasy points. So, yes. But it is the mean. It is the arithmetic mean, not the middle outcome, not the median. You can see middle outcomes in a build by shifting to the 50th percentile, but you cannot edit those outcomes. You cannot edit middle outcomes, just like you cannot edit other percentiles. So you can look. Well, actually, there's a couple different ways. You can see the median outcomes here. So these are the medians. So yeah, you said if we change mean to 50th percentile, yeah. So these are your median outcomes, but these are editable in a literal, you can change the number way, but you cannot change. I guess what I'm saying is you can't change the stored 50th percentile outcome as it is stored. Here, I'll show you kind of one other way of what I mean here. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit here, but like these values, a common question we get is, can I change this? Can I literally change this? And the answer is no, but you can functionally change this by adjusting. The adjustment you make here, for all intents and purposes, changes this value as well to be 51.5, even though yes, 51.5, even though the written value here doesn't change. So anyway. Okay, let's keep it going. And if you can explain a little bit more, or maybe if you want to ask in Slack or something like that, what the OLS regression thing is, happy to give my best shot at that as well. But for now, Vincent says, can a 5-game main slate be added for the NHL on Saturday for the FHWC? It's just the 5 games because they aren't doing late swap. Yeah. Yes, I will make a note of that, actually. Obviously, we won't have like that. That slate is not going to be loaded until much later into the week. Just like other Saturday slates will. I think normally those get added automatically. Like, I don't think that requires any additional work from us because those are posted slates on the sites. But I will make sure that it gets on there. So, and congratulations to you as well for your ticket. We've got some live finalists this week. So Chris PM says, what is the suggested sliders for a GPP with a 150 lineup limit? I adjusted a bunch of time, but it still comes up as a 20 lineup GPP. That's strange. So you should be able to adjust to the 150 max. Keep in mind that you cannot build more than 20 lineups at a time if you are on the starter plan. The starter plan is limited to 20 max lineups. So it's possible that if you're on starter, you might be seeing that. You should be able to otherwise change this to 150 and see what the default sliders are for your particular contest. If for some reason you are on the advanced plan and you still cannot change the entry limit to 150 max, what I would instead recommend doing, or not instead, what I would do is report a bug using this in the settings here, report a problem, and give us a brief description of what's going on, and we'll take a closer look because that sounds like a bug. But okay. Well, so this is for MMA, so I missed that. But for MMA, we don't have recommended sliders at the moment, mostly because we are actually very, very, I've been saying this for a while that this is something we want to do. We are very, very close to having this done. But at the moment, these are just average projections, right? They are based on simulations, these projections that are in here, but they are not directly leveraging the sims. So the sliders are just defaulted at 0-0 for everything. We don't have the entry drop downs. There has been some interesting discussion in our Slack channel for MMA about what optimal sliders are. If I can give advice overall on what I would use in the meantime, while this looks like this, I would be aggressive with both your ownership fade and your randomness. I typically use something that looks like this when I've been playing MMA. Having a very aggressive approach to randomness and ownership fade. It's a high variance sport. It's a sport where avoiding duplication is important. I think being aggressive with both of these sliders is important here. If you were building for this, in this case, you can just change this number directly. If you want 150, down here. So sorry, I misunderstood the original question. Eric says, tonight has a lone late game. Would you make any rules so that you get players for that game so you're not dead by the time it starts? For example, Sabonis. I don't think you need to. I do think if there is significant late news pending for that game, that it might be interesting to retain a little bit of flexibility to swap, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. There are definitely some questionable players playing in this game, but it's not any extremely core players to that particular game. So with as much value as there is elsewhere in the slate, I don't think I would force any exposure to this late game necessarily. You'll probably get quite a bit naturally because it's a high total game. 230, right? Yeah, I mean the Lakers Spurs is going to be super popular. Actually, maybe not so much. There's a couple of high total games, but Eric said, what do I get if I take down that live final with the SaberSim logo? Lol, JK, thanks, man, for the help. Yeah, you got it. I think I don't know. I think the live finals are like captured still in the winner circle rules, but there's a note here, I think. I'm pretty sure we honor these because they're pretty like. So I don't know what the payout is, but if you take it down, I believe you are. You'll get your winner circle goodies. So Let's see. Guy Will Gamble says, "Oh yeah, I remember you DM'd me, so it's on my list to get back to you before the end of the day. But maybe this is the same question. What are some considerations you take when considering whether to play bigger contests, more slates, or an additional site?" Yeah, this is the DM. I remember this now. FanDuel has a pretty big chasm. That's chasm, right? In stakes after maxing all the GPPs below 3. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think probably the optimal thing to do is to branch out, play some DraftKings. It's probably what makes the most sense, right? So if you're playing, if you're playing the piggy bank shot, the fadeaway, which is the quarter on FanDuel, not the big one like it is on DraftKings. The 222, some of those, the SWAT, the dribbler, right? The single entry and 3 maxes under $3, right? These are also a lot of the same contests that have good effective entrance. Like that's basically a couple single entries are good. But there's like, you go above the $3 range, you got the $5, the $10 single entries on FanDuel. Once you're playing most of those, I think it's a good idea to jump over to DraftKings and get some of your action down there, because there's also really good contests on DraftKings. You can play the quarter jukebox, which is the 20 max quarter. You can play the $1 20 max, the and one, great contest. There's also the, the daily dollar and the block. I think it's the elbow shot on DraftKings. This is how I spend way too much time in the lobbies for these sites, that I have the actual contest names memorized. I'm sure a lot of you guys do too. But anyway, DraftKings, there's a lot of other contests that are good to get down on DraftKings as well. There's also a $4 20 max on DraftKings that's really good. That gets you a little bit more action down. So yeah, I think like if you were playing optimally, if you were trying to maximize EV, what I would recommend doing is playing all of the great over 1,000 effective entrance contests that are under $3 on one site. And once you fill those up, then jump to the other site, right? And fill the equivalent contests up there. Then once you've done that, there are some interesting questions about where you want to go from there. You have to make some sacrifices at that point. I think there's a compelling argument for a lot of different approaches. I think there's a compelling argument to jump up in stakes and play single entries, because single entries will retain their effective entrance for much longer. A lot of times, even the $40 single entry on DraftKings has 1,000 effective entrance, right? Now you are playing $40 into a single entry, which breaks one of our rules, but you are playing in a contest that will probably play a little softer. Another option would be playing some more of the low stakes contests like the mini max, where you are going to sacrifice your EV in the forms of effective entrance, but you are going to have a much smoother variance and get a lot more lineups in play. Another option, I think at that point, I think in particular FanDuel, the flagship contest on FanDuel every night, personally, I think is far better than the flagship contest on DraftKings, mostly because the effective entrance generally grades out a lot better because it's a lower dollar entry point. So tonight it's $9. It still has a better effective entrance than DraftKings, but there are nights where this is a lot higher of a number when they're playing maybe the 444 or something like that, or the 555. This isn't actually the worst contest in the world to play some entries into if you're looking for additional action. So yeah, again, kind of in summary here, I think it is optimal to spread out to the other site once you're playing the best contests on one of them. But once you are filling those up, you have to kind of make some decisions on what you want to do. And some of that is personal. Some of that is the personal type of player you are. Like I am always way more interested in getting in more lineups in play than I am in playing like a $40 or a $50 or a $100 single entry. I will always do that. I am a multi-entry guy down to my core. I always have been. So I would rather start incorporating more lineups once I'm playing the best contests on both sites than rising in stakes. But if you are a sharper single entry player or a 3 max kind of player, it may make more sense for you to approach it that way. So, but let me know if that helps. What is this referring to? CMC man? DeWho? Did I mispronounce Murray's name? I always thought this was DeWante Murray. Is it not pronounced that way? I assume that's what you're referring to, but I might be wrong. But there was a question about this on one of our other streams last week too. I guess this is a simple Google search away from me figuring this out. But Maybe I'm wrong. So I always thought it was Devontae. Yeah, that's what I say too. Devontae. But anyway. All right, cool. I got to keep getting to some questions here. I can't mess around on how to pronounce names. Okay. JWH says he's coming back and giving me a lesson on the OLS regression. So, yeah, let me know. I would appreciate that. Eric said, last couple days been getting duped by other SaberSim users. Any way to avoid this? Best way is crank your sim variance slider up, right? Use a smaller set of sims for each individual lineup. It's going to make it more likely that you get more unique lineups overall. In the contest where I don't think you're super likely to get duped in like main slates and classic slates, I do think you've got a decent shot at getting duped, period, in showdowns and smaller slates like turbos and night slates, right? That's not even a question of like avoiding SaberSim duping. That's you are more likely to get duped in those contests, period. Best ways to avoid duplication in those kinds of contests: cap your maximum salary, right? 49,500, 49,000 even. And do play differently, right? Differentiate yourself. Fade the chalkiest captain, right? Let's you know what, for the hell of it, let's go over here and talk a little bit of duplication avoidance strategy, right? A couple things I like to do. So I mentioned cap your max salary, right? By default, 49.9. You can take this a step further, 49.5, right? And then come over here and differentiate yourself, right? How do you play a unique lineup? Well, do something that nobody else is going to do. A couple ways that I like to do that is, again, I mentioned fading the chalkier captains. I also think you can take a lineup construction that's going to be unpopular. So let's look at this, right? Chalky captains, looks like we're fading them already. At least we expect them to be RJ Barrett and De'Aaron Fox. You want to take that one step further? Maybe you cross off Sabonis. Maybe you cross off Randall, right? Play some unique captains. There's a lot of variety on what can be optimal for these kinds of contests. So another way to do that is, it looks like in this game, high game total where the Kings are slightly favored, at least according to our sims, right? That would probably require a little bit more digging into, but I think that's what it looks like, right? So only play lineups where, here, cross off all your 3-3s and only play lineups where it's overweight to the King or to the Knicks. There's another great way to get different, right? That'll lower your chance of being duplicated a bit. You could also only play Knicks at captain, you know? So same thing, right? This is true for a lot of other sports. It is a common goal in showdowns in general to avoid duplication. And these are always my fallbacks: is lower your maximum salary, do something different at the captain position, and differentiate your construction in terms of who you're stacking, right? There's a couple things that people always use too much salary, or not too much, but people always try to use all their salary. People always pick the perceived best players in the game at their captain spot, the perceived best overall, highest projected players. And people generally build balanced, right? Or overly correlate their lineup construction to the Vegas line for the Vegas spread for the game, right? They will overstack to the favorite in a game where they big spread, and they will build a balanced build or slightly lean towards the favorite in a game with a tighter spread. So Dentito says, I'm trying to set a rule that will include 2 players in the same game. However, when I start the build, my lineups do not include any players that I specified in the rules settings. Will include 2 players in the same game. Okay, let's jump over to that here. So you should be able to set a stacking rule to do exactly this thing. So we go to build lineups, go to the rules tab, stacking, add a basic rule, and then at least 2 players from the same game. From here, you can select your individual teams that you want to be included in this. So let's use the example from before that we want some ability to preserve late swap flexibility all the way through the end of the night. So let's pick the Knicks and Kings. And then if we build this should work. It is possible there's a bug, but I don't think there is. So let's see. Moment of truth arriving here quickly. The suspense is killing me. All right. That Julius Randle exposure seems encouraging. So it should be 2 players from the same game. No guarantees that we get them from the same team. Oh. Nope, something's up. That didn't seem to work, right? This one doesn't work. Let me see that rule again. So what I suspect is going on here. All right. That is in some capacity a bug. What I suspect is going on here is that the team selection isn't working. So it's just making sure that there are 2 players from any game the same here. Not always the Kings and Knicks game. So yeah, that's a bug. Let me scratch a couple notes down real quick here so I don't forget. The first one was the FHWC slate, and then this one is the 2 players from same game issue. Actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's this is what I recommend, guys, if you see a bug when you're actually working on SaberSim. So let's demo this real quick. So we set a rule for 2 players from the Knicks Sacramento game, and not every lineup has 2 players from that game. And now our wonderful support team will investigate that. So cool. If that does happen, one thing that you may be able to do is to just go in here and say that you want 100% game stacks for a particular game. Okay, in this case, we can't because we don't have enough lineups for it. So good find. We will get that fixed. But John says, I like to play single game, but I can't completely make my roster in step 3 after the research build. I might need a little more information. I think maybe this is a follow-up to the question that we talked about before. I mean, again, remember, like, if you are trying to like lock certain players in and get a certain lineup construction and you can't get there, right? It's saying to you that there's not a single lineup in your pool that gets you there, that makes that is possible, that is optimal. I mean, one thing you can do is go back to step 1 and lock more players in before starting your build. But I do think that's a moment to take pause and say, is this actually a good lineup before forcing that in? But let me know. I might be totally misunderstanding this here. If there's something, I can't completely make my roster in step 3 after the research build. Yeah. Let me know. I might need a little bit more info there. All right, let's see. Vincent said, I know it's early. Okay, this is a question. Yeah, we'll make sure that the live final slate gets added. Dynastic Vision says, Jordan, if the max entry for a game is 25, would you set the lineup builder to 150 max or use the 20 max entry pick? I would just use the 20. It's going to be close enough. It should work. There's not going to be a dramatic difference in optimal strategy in a 20 max versus a 25 max. So I would just use the 20 max. That's what I do. Like when I play the pick and roll on FanDuel, which is the 25 max, at least most of the time it is, I would just build as if it was the 20 max. So. Oh, okay. All right. Let's see. We're getting caught up to all the Murray conversation here. So Guy Will Gamble said, I think it's DeJounte. And then Brett said it's DeJounte. And then CMC said, yeah, it's more like DeJounte. Okay. So it's DeJounte. Gotcha. DeJounte Murray. Great. Well, thanks. Now I know. Cool. Neil says, avoiding duplicates is why I'd like to see product ownership rather than cumulative ownership. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. What's awkward about that is, I guess, like we'll like probably, it's just going to be a long decimal, right? Like it is a little bit awkward about the way that that's presented, but I do think I think it would be valuable for us to include that. So I saw that in the wish list channel. So it's on our, it's something that is noted on our end because I do think it would be interesting. So DeJounte Murray, man, now I'm all right. You learn something new every day. Anyway, Merso said, what time are the SaberSim projections finalized? Usually crunch about 3 times, 15 minutes before lock, 10 before lock, 5. They're usually all different. Well, 2 things on that. You can always see where our last updated is up here in the top right. There is more detailed information in our Slack channel, in the NBA lineup alerts channel, where you can actually see what when sims for certain games start and finish. We're also plugged into the Underdog NBA Twitter feed there, so you can kind of track like news breaks, sim starts, sim finishes. Great. So I definitely recommend joining the Slack, joining up to Slack and following that channel so that you can see that information. With that said, you are likely always to get different lineups, even if you build with the exact same information over and over, because of the way that we build lineups at SaberSim. So when you build your lineups here, you are not using the average projections for your lineups. What you are actually doing is you are taking a random bucket of game simulations for each individual lineup, and you are building the best possible lineup that can be built for that set of sims. The bigger your sim variance slider is, the smaller that bucket of simulations is. So at 10, for example, we're using a single game simulation to build each lineup, which means there is natural variance in the way that your lineups are built. Your lineups are likely to be varied slightly every single time you press build, even if no news has broken, which ultimately is a good thing. It reflects the natural variance of the game. It also lessens the chance of duplicating other SaberSim users. Overall, it adds diversity and upside to your lineups, but it does mean that you will not get the same lineups every single time you build. I would argue that a builder, an optimizer that does give you the same lineups every single time you build is artificially overinflating the expected value of those lineups. A builder that does that is implying to you that there is a single most optimal lineup that you could play and that it is very easy for the builder to find. Neither of those things are true. The differentiation between the top overall expected lineups in a 8-game NBA slate, for example, is a lot thinner than that. And it's certainly not something that's that easy to just like find like a traditional optimizer does. There's a lot of variety of what the highest expected value lineups can look like. So hopefully that helps. But Dante says, can you show me in League of Legends how to set a rule to make a 4-2 stack with a different team from my stacks? Basically saying a 4-2 stack of 2 different teams and team slot completely diff. Okay, let's look at it. Let's try. 4-2 stack with a different team. Okay, I got it. So the team is never included. The team is never included in the 4 stack. Am I understanding that correctly? Show me in League of Legends how to set a rule to make a 4-2 stack with a different team from my stacks. Yes. Okay. I think that. Okay. I'll just explain it either way. I'm kind of understanding this in 2 different ways. So we're gonna pretend it's both. So let's do. I think this will go better for a bigger slate. So let's do the LCS from Saturday. Okay. So what I would do is I would go in here, set your settings, and then set 2 different stacking rules. So the first is I would say at least 4 players from the same team. That includes every position but does not include the team slot. So this is going to mean that every single lineup is going to have a 4 stack, but the team position will never be used in the 4 stack. That might be all you wanted here. I'm not positive that's all you wanted, but that might be all you wanted. Assuming that I'm understanding this correctly, and what you actually want is a 4-2 where the one-off is always the team position, then I would also add this in. And then that should work. So let me know if that helps. Dentito said, I may have resolved the bug. I removed any filters that I set and ran the lineups and the rules to include 2 players from the same game seem to have worked. Interesting. Maybe it did. I'm glad you were able to get it worked out. That is obviously still something we need to fix. So, all right, let's see. Brad said, this isn't relevant to anything we are doing here, but how did SaberSim come about? Just a bunch of friends wanted to change things, or what? How big is the team? That's a fun question. This SaberSim's origin story is actually that SaberSim Matt, built a baseball simulator. At least as I understand it, the intention here was never really directly DFS related. Like, I don't even think DFS was as big when this was kind of all got started here. But Matt built a baseball sim. There are some interesting old internet relics out there if you do a little bit of investigation detective work of some of the kind of original, I don't know, notes and content and things like that from the OG, the birth of SaberSim, the originations of the baseball sim. But that's kind of the origin story. JG, Bridge the Gap DFS, John Gustafsson also has some interesting SaberSim videos on his YouTube channel that show much older versions of SaberSim. Like this is essentially SaberSim 3, this version. There are some interesting videos. SaberSim 2 was the classic app that probably many of you are familiar with, but maybe not all of you. It's the app that comes up here if you click this. SaberSim 1 was a much more earlier version than that. Then I think there are probably some OGs maybe listening in here that were around even earlier than that. That predates me. So, but how big is the team? I think is eight of us, 8 to 10. I'd have to add everybody up, but pretty small group. So, John said, like Nuggets versus Warriors single game. Oh, single game slate. Well, I guess my answer from before is still kind of true. So if you're trying to hand build a single lineup, right? I think actually I remember I've seen your screenshots in Slack before, John, and I think you are a FanDuel guy, if I remember correctly. So the answer is still the same though, either way, like even if it's a single game, right? So if you go in here and you're building your lineup, right? So the steps I would take are still the same, right? Build yourself a big pool. Give yourself some room to work, right? We can set this here. Single entry. Say you're playing something like this, right? I always like to use sim variants on 10 for single games. So give yourself a nice big pool here. And what I would do, to be completely honest, is I would build this set of lineups. And if you hit the point where you can't get the exact lineup that you want, like I would probably abandon that lineup. This is stuck, right? Because what that's actually saying is that lineup for this particular game is not one of the first 1,500 optimals, right? If you already know that you want to play that lineup, just enter it. But if you can't get to it automatically, via SaberSim in step 3, then maybe it's not a great lineup, right? I would abandon a part of that. Like here, I'll give you kind of an example here. We'll do a similar quick demo of what we did before on the main slate. So let's say you're playing, the New York Sacramento lineup here, Sacramento game. And okay, so let's say you look at this first off and say, I don't want to play any Julius Randle MVP, right? Okay, so I'll play Sabonis MVP, fine, but I don't even want to play Randle. I'm like really aggressively fading Randle, right? So maybe this is a fun way to do it, right? I'm going to fade Randle. Okay. And you keep going, right? And maybe, I don't know, maybe you don't want to play Burks at the pro spot, right? And you're going through this. Eventually we can do this here. Let's just force this to happen, right? Let's say lock. So eventually we're going to get this message here. And it says, we need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures, right? This is basically saying there is not a single lineup in the pool of 1,500 that has Lamb MVP with no Julius Randle and no Alec Burks, right? Those are the changes we've made, right? Like if there's some hypothetical lineup that you have in mind here that you had wanted to play, just enter that lineup. Like I don't think you need SaberSim to necessarily validate it for you. But if you were doing this and this failed, I would back something off. I would take off the most recent thing you did and play the next best possible lineup. So overall, I think the strategy is still the same. So, okay, Jacob said, on Friday, Jokic was in a smash spot against the Rockets. He ended up being a late addition to the injury report post-lock with an illness and ultimately got ruled out at 7:55 p.m. Eastern time. I immediately went to the Denver player projections and noticed they had not been updated to reflect the Joker's absence. It is pretty quick. It is not immediate. I played that slate as well. So yeah, 5 minutes after lock, we got news that Joker was questionable. And then I think it was 5 minutes before so he played at 7 p.m. Mountain, 9 p.m. Eastern. 5 minutes before the 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain, which is my time zone, lock, we got news that Joker was out. That sim takes a second to run. It can take a couple minutes to run. We get it up as quickly as possible. I would say in general, we're almost always going to have that up to date before that game starts. But I think we might, I don't know for a fact that we got that sim in before that next round of games started. That is a challenge for everybody, right? Like we're moving as quickly as we can. I mean, I don't even want to say we're moving. The sim is moving as quickly as we can. And we put a ton of effort into making those sims as fast as possible, but they are not instantaneous. I think the actual, I think Jokic actually getting marked as out and having a 0 projection in the app is essentially instantaneous, but the updated sim that comes out that it changes all the other projections around that is not instantaneous. And there are often other sims that will run too. So like the first one, you'll see it kind of fine tune and dial in. Like there'll be a sim that runs where everybody gets a big boost. And then there'll be kind of next sim that kind of brings everybody down a little bit. And then maybe one that brings them back up, and it'll kind of level off and settle in at a certain number. They go about as fast as we can get them done. All the hamsters running as quickly as possible in their wheels. No, that's not actually what happens, but it's kind of a funny image. Anyway, jokes aside, on a practical level, like what can you do when that situation happens? Like, let's say, for example, right? Like, let's say it happens again tonight. So let's say like 3 minutes before the 6 p.m. game locks, we get news that Jokic is going to sit, right? That would be a significant change to the context of the slate. You have an hour before his game starts, but you need to figure out where all that salary is going to go. You want to probably reshuffle around the lineup constructions overall, and you want to have as much flexibility as possible. Like, you have 2 minutes before this game starts, and you're waiting for a sim to finish. What can you do to maybe handle that? What I would do, if maybe you don't think you're going to have time, is I would look at the Nuggets, and I would go in and I would uncheck Jokic. This is actually literally what I did that night. And I think this is one way to do it. And then come in here and like boost these guys, right? Like +5 everybody. And you're under the clock. And well, that's not +5. You're sweaty and you're trying to get this all in at the last second. And this isn't going to be perfect. But what it is going to do is it's going to give you at least something to work with. Late swap. And then as the sims kind of settle in as this game approaches, remove these. And let then actually, if you want to, assuming you want to, then use the actual projections that things settle into when they do. So, but yeah. All right. Let's see. I still have some other questions in the Office Hours channel. All right. Let's jump back to those of you that asked questions in the Office Hours channel now up to an hour ago. Appreciate your patience. And to everybody here that is participating, watching, asking questions, just hanging out today, I appreciate all you guys as well. We're at a little over an hour and a half today. Probably getting close to our longest Office Hours stream ever, which is pretty cool. I'm always happy to do this stream as long as you guys have questions. So that is it's pretty sick. Let's keep it going. Anyway, is it profitable over long term to use the 100 Saber score in single entries over going 20 through 100 or 500 lineups to pick a lineup? I've back tested a little and I found that the 100 Saber score usually isn't the highest scoring lineup out of 20 lineups. I want to know your thoughts on this. Yeah, so this is like a sample size issue, right? If you compare one lineup to a set of 20, it is much more likely that the highest scoring lineup is going to be in the set of 20 than it is going to be the individual one lineup, just because you're comparing unfair sample sizes together, right? You should at least, if you want to do this kind of back testing, at least make sure these sizes are the same. So compare the first 10 lineups in your pool to compare to the next 10 over a long period of time, and see if on average the first 10 are higher scoring than the second 10. That is still a huge sample size issue there. That to be confident in that measurement, you're probably going to need to collect data for a while. But it's not fair. It's not fair to compare one lineup to a set of 20 and expect that one lineup is going to consistently outperform all 20 of the others. So, the question here of, is it profitable long-term to use the 100 SaberScore and single entries over going 20 through 100 or 500 to pick a lineup? With that said, SaberScore is a tool. I always like to think about SaberScore as your tiebreaker. Once you have inputted all of your other value to your process you have edited exposures, or in the case of a single entry, you have locked certain players in, you've removed others, you've inputted all your other value. At that point, then allow SaberScore to help determine what lineup, like let's say you have a 500 lineup pool and you've made a bunch of changes to your player pool, and you're trying to find one lineup, and at the end of all of that, there are 17 different lineups that fit based on the players that you've locked and excluded and whatever, and team stacks and things you've adjusted, right? Well, at that point, let SaberScore help decide what the best lineup of that 17 is to play. But I don't think you need to treat SaberScore in a vacuum as the end all be all, right? If you have adjustments you want to make and you want to play, if you want to play lineup number 23 instead of lineup number 1, do it. The difference between the SaberScore from that set is not so crazy different that I would recommend you just blindly play lineup number 1. So SaberScore, I would treat, the way I like to think about this is that treat your entire pool of lineups that you build from a build as viable, as lineups that you could play if you wanted to. Use SaberScore as a tiebreaker to decide between them when you have inputted all of the other value you want to your own individual process. And if you are going to judge lineups, and if you want to backtest SaberScore, which is great, let me know what the results of them are, because we always want to get better. But test them fairly. Test groups of lineups against each other in a fair way. So if you're going to, if you want to pit the first 100 highest saber scoring lineups against the next 100 highest saber scoring lineups, then do that. But there are frequently questions where somebody says, why is the number 1 saber score not the highest scoring lineup in my entire pool? Like 1,499 lineups are almost always going to beat one lineup. So, all right, let's see. Okay. Quick clarification here. If I have GPP entries, single entry of 4, 3 max of 2. So I need 10 total lineups, and I use the GPP 3 max to build 8 lineups, and I want to use the 8 line. Oh gosh, I want to use the 8 in my lineups, and we'll have overlap for 2 lineups. How do I do that in the fill lineups step and make sure that I don't get lineups overlap? I want to keep 8 separate lineups throughout the night. How do I do that? Okay, let me read this again. So you're playing 4 single entries and 2 3 maxes. And you want 8 lineups. Okay, so I think this is pretty simple. I think here's what I would do. So let's use my contest as an example. So let's say I want, let's say I'm only using these. I don't have the exact same situation you have here, right? But here's 5 entries, right? So let's say I hypothetically just want to play 3 unique lineups for this, just as a hypothetical, right? If I build 3, make a really small pool because I don't need extra lineups here. And sorry, I've been waiting. Sorry, this has taken so long for me to get back to you here. But So I would build, so in this case, for your example, I would build 8, right? I would go build the 8 lineups that you have, and then check the contests that these lineups apply to here. Just like I did here. Oh, that was weird. Okay. So check the lineups that these apply to, and then use the unique random fill is what I would do. And then what this is going to do is it's going to say you're going to have to dupe twice. Duplicate, yes. But we will never duplicate within the same entry, right? So there's going to be, like, this is going to have this 3 max is going to have all 3 lineups in it, right? And the dribbler and the block each are going to have a random lineup from those 3 in there, but there won't be 2 of the same lineups, for example, in the swap. So you won't dupe within the same contest. The same example for your contest here. And we'll track that throughout the night just as well too. So like, you know, if I went into swap here, it's still going to recognize that there are 3 unique lineups here. Well, it will once I download. So it's picking up that we have 3 unique lineups. So that should work. Okay. See some follow-up here from about the regression stuff. We'll chat about that a little bit more in the future. I'll need some time to prepare for that conversation and maybe read through some of these comments here. Another question from Edward here. This one says, going through your last example, when you lock in certain players and that player gets eliminated prior to a later lock, what happens to that lineup? Will SaberSim swap in players that later get ruled out? I'm a little confused here. I think probably because I didn't see this question come in live on what I was talking about. Where you lock in... Okay, so I think what this is about is how I was describing like hand picking a lineup as opposed to hand building one, where I was like locking in players and arriving at a final single entry just to enter. All of that locking and removing players in step 3 only refers to that one individual build. It is not as if those players are actually removed or locked or anything like that in your broader pool. And with that said, I believe even if you lock in a player, if that player actually gets literally ruled out, like that player gets an out status, injury designation, and is out, we will still remove that player from your pool. Mostly to protect people from a situation where maybe you lock in, you have LeBron James locked and he gets ruled out. We will still remove him and remove the lock so that you don't get screwed, I believe is how that works. So, and let me know if I understood that question correctly here. CMC Man said it will be great if there's a filter for contests at the top. That way, when you need to select the right contest, you don't need to check them individually. Yeah, that's a good idea. The entry editor is going to change. Spoiler alert. We're working on it right now. There are things. The entry editor is freaking cool. I would even say I think it was revolutionary when we came out with it. I think it still is, to be honest. There is not really anything else like that in the industry in terms of a way to manage your contests like this. But since it has been out, it's been out for a little over a year now, I think. Probably about 15 months, I think. Our little entry editor had its first birthday earlier this year. There are things we are aware of are a little awkward to use with it. So we are kind of putting together a plan for a project to make some changes. Actually, I don't even want to say that. Makes it sound like we just started. We have a plan to make some pretty solid UX and quality of life changes to the entry editor that is in progress. So, okay. Well, how about that? What a stream. Hour and 45 minutes today. It was a fun one. We talked about a lot, as you might expect. We talked about changes. We started our humble beginnings talking about the differences and the advantages and disadvantages to editing in steps 1 and step 3. We talked a lot about kind of I mentioned hand picking your lineups, building a big pool of lineups for yourself, and then locking and removing players in to arrive at a single final lineup to play. We talked about, oh gosh, I don't even remember everything else. All kinds of stuff. Stacks, research builds. We talked about late swap flexibility, managing late swap, what to do when news breaks. So it was a really fun stream. Great way to start the week off. We'll go ahead and cap it off there. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated. Big thank you to everybody that watches this show or listens to this show in the evening or after it goes live as a recording. My commuter squad, I see you guys. Love you guys. We will be right back again tomorrow. Same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. So enjoy the slate tonight. Expect late swap fireworks. We will probably get some of them as we approach the spring NBA season. And we will be right back here again tomorrow. So until then, take care. See ya. And also, thank you to everybody that helped me learn how to pronounce DeJounte Murray's name. Now I can do his name justice, especially as I proceed to roster 80 to 100% of him in my lineups tonight. Maybe. We'll see. But until then, take care, guys. See ya.